word got back to Washington, you mean they didn't fire a shot and they won that battle? I said, the guy's got to be mad to do something like that. So that's how that story got started. There's probably some other ways too. Some guys didn't like him because of his aggressiveness. The guy's mad. All they did was try to run away, and he captured him, brought him back, and hung him. You know, one of those things. The guy's crazy. Well, he had to have discipline back in those days. Discipline was very important in the army. So he formed up. He had permission to develop 4 sub-legions. He's their last chance. They're thinking, Washington's thinking, we got to conquer these Indians this time because the people along the East Coast are getting upset about some of their sons and daughters perhaps going to the West and getting killed by the Indians. And said, this is it. We got to do this right. And so they assigned Anthony Wayne. Didn't have a great reputation at the time, but he's been given the assignment. He says, we're going to do this. We're going to do it right. I want my men in uniform. I want to be able to tell who's who out there. 4 sub-legion. Each sub-legion will have their own riflemen, their own cavalry, their own artillery, their own infantry, and their own dragoons. And he's going to have them in different colors. In this case, on the right, you got white as be the first sub-legion. The second sub-legion was in red, and he also had yellow and green. So as he was conducting a battle, he could look out and see where his sub-legions were and send messengers, or sometimes have the drummers drum off the message where they need to go, or trumpeters would trumpet what they were supposed to do. They had signals back in those days for all this type of training. And he was obsessive about training these guys. He wanted them to be the best marksmen you could be. So there you can see what they look like. These are called sub-legions. The first sub-legion was in white. Okay, we'll move on here. So he trains them up and raises them up in Pittsburgh right here. The recruits are coming in from the East Coast, some of them, and from all over Pennsylvania and the other states. They were drafting as much as they could, taking volunteers as much as they could, and they would show up at Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was kind of a wild town, and you had some Fort Pitt there. And in fact, some of the people that showed up, they had good intentions of joining Wayne, but they didn't like it. He says, I'm getting out of here. And if you left, he would track them down. He would send officers after these guys. They'd bring them back, and for emphasis, he would perhaps hang them right in front of everybody to warn the others, don't do that. You know, don't take off on us. Now, sometimes they'd bring them back, act like they're going to hang them, and then didn't hang them. You know, put the fear of God in them, I guess you could say. So it's too wild of a town for Anthony Wayne. Sorry, got ahead of myself there. And he says, we're going to go down the river. So he loads up on about 66 flatboats and goes down what he calls Legionville, named after his legion. And they set up a camp. He's got to train them up. He wants them to the point where they can react to things and fight the way the Indians fight and go into the old Northwest Territory, prepared to do that. So they're doing shooting every day. They are shooting. He has blacksmiths fixing up the guns they're going to use, their muskets, so they're easier to load. They can actually load them up on the run instead of standing there and having to ram in the musket ball and all that. So, and he's got cavalry as well. So he's setting up the logistics because he's going to have to take horses with him. He's going to have to take food with him to feed the horses. He's got a band that's going to lead the way as well. He's training up the band. He wants beautiful music for his army. And so they take off finally. 92, they get permission to head on down the river, 66 flatboats. The first flatboat's the band leading the way with music. Wayne's in the second boat. And then he's got all his infantry and food following behind him on other flatboats. So as they come down the river, they stop at Marietta where Fort Harmer was. And every time they stopped off, the first ones off were the riflemen, and they were to expand off. He was obsessed with not being ambushed by the Indians, just like St. Clair got caught by surprise. Washington told him, don't you get caught by surprise. Okay, and when Wayne was surprised, he didn't want to die anyway either. So the first ones off were riflemen, then the infantry would get off, and the cavalry, they'd get the horses out there. They'd set up camp. The camp tents had to be lined up perfectly, and the first thing they did was go out and start practice shooting as soon as they got off their flatboats and set up their tents. Or they were drilling, marching, riding their horses. The band was playing. It was a circus. So on they went, And every time they stopped, the same thing was done. The riflemen went off first, checking out the forest, making sure there are no Indians out there ready to ambush them. And then the infantry would get off, the cavalry and everything else. Shooting practice would take place. They had some of Harmer's men along here were called rangers. And once in a while they'd meet up with a bunch of rangers, and Wayne would say, let's take those rangers on in a shooting contest. And so he'd have his infantry, his dragoons or whatever set up, and the rangers would join him, and they'd have shooting practice and contests. Wayne just loved it. He said, this is great. This is going to make us even sharper. So we're going to keep on going down the river. They make their way to Cincinnati. There's the same jump-off point. They got a nice fort right there called Fort Washington. He says, Fort Washington is crazy. This town's nuts. There's too much drinking going on. He moves them to a place called Hobson's Choice. The guy named Hobson, you can either camp here or you can go on down the river. Hobson didn't care. And so Wayne says, all right, we're going to take this, call this Hobson's Choice. He gave us the choice of staying or going on down. So that was the last name of that guy that owned that property right there. Just on the west side of a creek in Cincinnati. So he has to wait till about late 1792 and 1793. Finally gets permission. There's no peace. There's negotiations going on about maybe with the Indians would allow the Americans to live in this land in peace, but those peace treaty talks broke down, and Wayne says, all right, we're moving out. He finally got permission. So the band's leading the way. He's got riflemen, he's got spies, he's got scouts way out in advance. He's got Simon Kenton with him. Daniel Boone didn't want to be a part of the army, but Simon Kenton didn't mind doing that. Simon Kenton comes in from Kentucky, and he's got some scouts, and there's all kinds of scouts. I added some characters, okay, in my story, so you're going to follow guys by the name of E.J. He's got a couple of buddies named Bobby and Ben. He's got Uncle Isaac coming along. Uncle Isaac lost his family in Pennsylvania. They were wiped out by Indians, and he's all depressed and wants to go down the river and join Harmer's army. That's how they get started in the first book. You also have Charlotte, that's E.J.'s girlfriend. And on the other side of the story, you've got the Indians. In Kekionga, besides Little Turtle, you have a Running Deer. I added a young Indian boy named Running Deer and his girlfriend Morning Bird. So you're going to follow them as they're interacting with the real people and the real events. Okay, so it's historical fiction. So we've got E.J. and Uncle Isaac and Bobby and Ben joining Wayne, and they're marching their way up. And Little Turtle and Running Deer, they see this army coming up, so things are getting a little bit crazy. They're getting a little bit excited up here. So they make their way up Fort Hamilton. Meanwhile, between 1791 and 93, they built another fort, St. Clair. There's a Fort Jefferson. And finally, the first fort that Anthony Wayne builds is called Fort Greenville in Greenville, Ohio. So here's another map to show you. Fort Washington, Fort Hamilton, Fort St. Clair, Fort Jefferson, and this is Greenville. And this is what Greenville looked like. It was a huge 50-acre fort. You had blockhouses out here, about 7 of them. You had bastions in the corner. They had barracks. They could hold 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers in here, troops, militia. His headquarters was in the middle right here. Wayne had headquarters in here. By the way, this is where the Treaty of Greenville was signed, right here. So we'll come back to this later on. But that's his first fort. It was a campsite for a while, and he said, we might as well build a fort. We're going to stay here for a while until we get further permission to move on. But they also had a supply problem. They had to feed all these guys. And where did the food come? Well, they could go out and hunt, but you got Indians out there, and that's kind of dangerous. Plus, there wasn't that many animals to hunt down. Evidently, there's enough hunting going on that it created a shortage of wild animals out there. So they had to bring supply trains up by pack horses and wagons to feed this guy and his army. And that was a big issue. He wanted to move on, but they didn't have enough food. You had to feed these guys when you get out there. All right, so they move on, and on the same spot that St. Clair's defeat took place during the winter of 93 and 94, Wayne sends a detachment ahead. They find all these bones of all these guys that had died 3 years prior, and the women and children along the way in the middle of this town called Fort Recovery, Ohio today. And Wayne says, you're going to build the fort right on top of this spot, and we're going to call it Fort Recovery and defy these Indians that they can't keep us out of this land. So this is what Fort Recovery looks like today down there in Fort Recovery, Ohio. You can see this. They got a nice little museum as well. It'll be a nice little day trip if you want to see what's there. And so they build a fort there, and then they move on. But I want to go back to this fort. This fort in 94, in June of 94, late June, is attacked by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket and many of the other coalitionist tribes that came down from Michigan and Ohio. They surrounded this fort, and there's about 200 Americans inside there. And 3 separate attacks, the Americans held them off. Now, the Americans lost a few guys, but the Indians lost more. And finally, they also had British with them as well. The British were going to supply some artillery for them. But 3 separate attacks take place on this fort, and they were able to withstand the Indians. All right, so then Wayne reorganizes. He finally gets permission to go farther. And in June and July, after the Battle of Fort Recovery, so you got 2 battles on the same spot, Fort Recovery, Ohio. You had St. Clair's defeat, and you had Fort Recovery under attack. So now we've moved on. This is the St. Mary's River. He built a Fort Adams right in this area, and it was more of a supply place. This picture is, again, one of those old ones back in 1912 or so, I think I found this. They think the fort was right here. He moves on, and he has to take, the Indians are moving on, so he has to go, his goal is to get to Defiance, and there's supposed to be a huge Indian village there. So he's got to take them across the Great Black Swamp. Oh, you've got black bear in there, you've got all kinds of wild boar that's surviving in this black swamp. This is Vanward, Ohio. You can see where Fort Recovery is. This is St. Mary's, Ohio. There's the Allglaze River. He kind of followed the Allglaze River. Up there were some sand dunes that he could take his pack horses on and wagons that could make it. They didn't know where that was until his spies found the Indians, watched the Indians where they went across the Black Swamp. So he said, we're going to go the same way. The water was foul. You couldn't drink it. Of course, you got snakes and all kinds of issues. Huge forests, huge trees, oaks and elm trees were existing at that time in this Black Swamp. You'd think they're surrounded by water. How would they grow in something like that? Well, they did. They got huge. And today, of course, it's all great farmland, probably the richest farmland in the country. This is Defiance, Ohio, right here. You've got Bowling Green, Ohio, up here. Fremont, Fostoria. Here's Fort Wayne. New Haven's right out here at the edge. I grew up right around in here. So that was the edge of the Great Black Swamp. Now, if you go way back, you're talking about, this was probably Lake Erie, extended way down here. And it just drained away into Lake Erie and became a swampland. So they make their way across. He's taken, his numbers fluctuate. Some guys, their time in the Army is out, and so they can go back home. Some of them re-enlist and stay with him, but at one time he had as many as 3,000. So he has some Kentucky militia joining him as well as his own sub-legions with him. So they're going to cross here, following the Allglaze River. I've talked to some farmers that they found remnants of the trail of where Wayne went through there. They're pretty sure there had been some studies by some of the universities, making sure that was Wayne's trail, or other, Harrison went across there too in the War of 1812. So anyway, they're making their way across. They come out by Defiance, and as many as 300 guys are sick. Swamp fever, malaria. Wayne himself is sick. He's got the gout as well, and he's sitting around for a week while they do this. They build this fort right at the Allglaze River and the Myaami River right here. You can go over there to Defiance, Ohio. There's a nice park right there where that fort used to be, and markers around there so you can tell where the blockhouses were, where the kitchen was. But he builds this fort from the timber around the area. You got 4 blockhouses. You can see some militiamen back in there, and there's some pack horses coming in with supplies. And from here, They said, where'd the Indians go? They left, this was called Oglay's Village. They left Oglay's Village just like they left Kekionga. And where did they go? They headed downriver. That's downriver, heading to the north, and sounds like it should be upriver. But going to the north and east, the Indians are heading to get some help from the British. So you've got Wayne right here. He's got his men ready to go. They're disappointed there's no Indians around here to fight. So they're going to have to cross the river and head up to the north and east along the Myaami River. So this is an area right here. This bridge was not in existence back in 1794. This was put in, I think, in the early 1800s to take electric trains across suburbia. But anyway, that is called the roastabout. The Indians would meet out in the middle of the Myaami River, and that's rock shale, whatever, limestone. They could sit out there and have a powwow and discuss what they were going to do strategically. You can see this today as you drive along Old 24, not the new 24, take the old 24, and it's right up by Waterville, just south of Myaami, Ohio. All right, so there they are right here, and they're heading this way. The Indians aren't here either. They'd moved on farther north and east. So Wayne follows them, and they finally get to some resistance. His spies are finally resisted by some Indians. There you can see the different tribes. The British were there. The Canadians were involved with their militia. The Wyandot, the Mingo, the Mohawk, the Myaami, the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, the Ottawa, and the Chippewa. And here's Wayne right here. He sets up his artillery in the middle. He's got his first sub-legion on the right. There's the third. The second's in back in reserve. The fourth's over here on the left. And so they start moving forward. And there's some resistance. It's about a 15-minute battle. Todd and his Kentucky militia under General Scott says they need help. Wayne signals them, get over there to the left. So they get around here to the end. Todd takes his militia over here. It's pretty scary. Those Wyandots made some weird noises, I guess, when they attacked. It was a loud pitch. A lot of their sounds, of course, would scare you to death. But these guys were trained up to very disciplined. Barbie and his Kentucky militia are back here in reserve. Finally, they call in the second sub-legion. And so the battle was a lot shorter than the Battle of Kekionga. I think we should get more credit here for what we do. But it was about a 15-minute battle, and then a 45-minute chase. Where did the Indians go? They headed back toward a place called Fort Myaami, where the British had built a fort. They weren't supposed to be there. This is American land, and the British had built a fort called Fort Myaami. So the Indians had retreated. The sub-legion, the cavalry are chasing them through these wooded areas. And here's an artist's depiction of what it looked like. You can see the Indians putting up some resistance. You can see the dragoons with swords and cavalry moving in as the battle took place. But some of the Indians would hide under the logs, and the infantry would have to root them out with their bayonets. It was a bad situation for the Indians. And obviously some Americans died in this battle as well. So they make their way up to, this is the Battle of Fallen Timbers up here, and there's Fort Myaami. So the Indians retreated to Fort Myaami, but were not allowed in. They went up to the gate. The fort wasn't that big anyway. They had like 1,000 Indians lined up in that battle. And at least 900 of them tried to get in that little fort. We're just go on up the road, or go on up the river. And the infantry was moving in, and Anthony Wayne finally shows up. They've got Fort Myaami surrounded, and Wayne takes a look at him and just shakes his head. He says, "What are you doing here?" He's thinking to himself. And so he rides up to that fort by himself, from what I understand, rides around the fort, and he could be picked off very easily by the British, but they didn't. They probably knew that that would cause the Second Revolutionary War. And Wayne had permission. He's 600 miles away from Philadelphia, which is the capital of the United States at that time. He had permission from Washington. Do what you have to do out there. We don't have time to send you, we don't have telephones or anything like that to tell you what to do. So Wayne looked at it. It took 3 days to decide. He talked to his officers, rode up and around again, and shook his head, shook his fist at him. And the British in there, they're anxious to shoot him. And so I'm not going to give away what happened. But they retreated. And the Legion moves way down the river, back up the river, I should say, to Fort Defiance, and they refortified Fort Defiance because he saw the artillery that the British had up there. It would have been a bloody attempt to take the British out at that time. They had enough men in there and artillery that we would have suffered a lot of casualties and Wayne took that under consideration. And so when he refortified Fort Defiance, those Indians and British could be coming up here and using that artillery. The fort at the time they left for the Fallen Timbers battle was not that strong. And so they refortified it, and then they traveled upriver heading toward Kekionga. And here's some pictures. I drove along the Myaami River. This would be about what the trail would look like, only it wasn't paved, obviously, back in those days. And here's a Bull Rapids road. They, from what I understand, some people who did some metal detecting found some remnants of Wayne's Legion that would have camped somewhere along here. There's a cemetery on the other side there. I've walked that, and there's no old graves there that go way back to 1794. But this has been, there's been some remnants found along this Bull Rapids road right here. That's the Myaami River. So what do? They finally make their way back in one day, late afternoon, and they camp, and the next day they make plans to build what's going to turn out to be Fort Wayne. You can see it had bastions on each corner and barracks inside. This was not going to hold 2,000 or 3,000 men. This is not that big. That's only 110 feet long. Looks like on both sides there, about 28 feet out here, 272-foot extension. They would have an artillery piece in each corner, and about 200 guys would man this fort. The rest of them are going to be camped on the outside of this fort as they build it. This was dedicated October 22nd, 1794. Does that date sound right? Yes, 1794. October 22nd, the exact date of the Battle of Kekionga. They dedicated this fort. So it's another way of Wayne saying, all right, we're back, we are here to stay. So they dedicate it, they name it Fort Wayne, and there I stand at the rock corner of Berry and Clay Street. There's a rock there with a plaque right there that tells about the fort. The fort would have been behind me where that building is, and on the other side there is a parking lot that would have extended into that parking lot, and there was a cemetery there as well. Some of the soldiers didn't survive. All right, so this is my next book, the third book that comes out, The Siege of Kekionga. So we're going to jump ahead. It's relatively peaceful from 1794 to 1811. And here's where the first fort was, right here. This is where Anthony Wayne's fort was built. It rotted away. In 1800, they decided to build another fort down the hill where the fire station number 1 is. And just to the east of fire station number 1, that's where it's set. And there's the Kekionga, there's the Myaami River, there's the St. Joe and the St. Mary's. You got the bridge, Columbia Street Bridge right there. And the fort today, from what I understand, if I remember right, is right in this area. There's a bend in the river. That's Spy Run. No, it'd be right in here somewhere. Okay, so we've got the second fort built right here. And that's in 1800. And so my adventure is going to get down the river with some of E.J. and Running Deer's offspring. They're going to make their way down the Wabash River and the Mississinewa River. And so there's some excitement in my third book as my story expands a little bit. This is called Hanging Rock down by LaGros, Indiana. And that's the Wabash River right there. There's an adventure that takes place on top of that hanging rock. And you can climb up there, but there's a little narrow stream. You get up there, there's no guardrail, so be careful if you're going to go up there. I've had a number of people that listen to my presentation that have been up there. You can see a long ways once you get up there, but it's about 75 foot high. You can see how the Indians would value that, looking up and down the Wabash River. They could see what was coming very easily from up there. And another place down along the Mississinewa River is called the Seven Pillars. And this is kind of a sacred area right here. These are like little caves. Evidently was quite valuable to the Myaami Indians that live along there, and they had some spiritual things. And where I'm standing is Myaami land. They have a little park down there where they do a lot of their ceremonies during the summertime especially. But this is called the Seven Pillars. All right, so we get there. This is Tecumseh now. Tecumseh's taken over leadership from Little Turtle. Little Turtle's aged up, so is Blue Jacket. So Tecumseh is stirring them up, along with his brother, the prophet. And there's William Henry Harrison, who's kind of taken over from Anthony Wayne as far as leadership. He's the governor of Indiana. He becomes the general, and he's going to lead the Americans. This is the prophet. The prophet is Tecumseh's brother. He's got one eye. He's got some spiritual things to him, at least he says. And he was doing some predicting. Now, some people say, well, he could read magazines back in those days and hear about there's going to be a meteor or there's going to be a comet that goes across, because there were some comets that took place. One was real bright, I think in 1811, that everybody said, well, this prophet knows what he's talking about. You know, he predicted that a few weeks ago. And then some other things that he predicted. And also at this time, there were earthquakes taking place. If you remember, in 1811, there was a huge earthquake in St. Louis, or where St. Louis is today, that changed the course of the Mississippi River. So I brought that out in the third story. It shook land all the way up, from what I understand, to Fort Wayne. People standing here at the fort could feel the quaking, and also along the Mississippi and the Wabash River. And that's clear over there where St. Louis, Missouri is. So I tried to bring that out in the story. My characters have aged up, obviously. And here is the Battle of Tippecanoe. So William Henry Harrison charged the Americans. They're moving up toward a place called Prophetstown. Tecumseh is not around at this time. He's down trying to recruit some other tribes in southern United States. And the prophet gets excited. And he says, I see this huge army. And he's thinking he's got about 1,000 natives fired up. And they're about a mile away from where Harrison had camped. Harrison shows up with this huge army from Vincennes, and the Indians show up and they say, what do you want? And we want to talk about peace.